was the kind of workout it needed. The setting was nice, though. Hard to fault that. The trustees' meetings always took place in the panelled dining room of Brackett's, and were held on Thursdays at 5, after the house and gardens had ceased to admit visitors. This was the last meeting of the season. At the end of the next week, coinciding with the end of October, the site would be closed to the public until the following Easter. Brackett's, set a little outside the downland village of South Stapley, was one of those houses which had grown organically. The oldest part was Elizabethan, and additions had been made in Georgian and Victorian times. Through the diamond-paned leaded windows, Carole Seddon could see over the house's rolling lawns to the gleam of the fast-flowing River Feather, which flowed into the sea some 15 miles away at Feathering. It was late autumn, when the fragile heat of the day gave way at evening to the cold breath of approaching winter, but perhaps one of the best times of year to appreciate the beauty and seclusion of the estate. Brackett's was an idyllic place to be the home of a writer. The writer to whom the shrine was dedicated was Esmond Chadleigh. His father, Felix, had bought Brackett's during the First World War, getting the property cheap, in a state of considerable dilapidation, and spending a great deal on loving restoration of the house and gardens. When Felix Chadleigh died in 1937, Brackett's was left to his son, and, funded by family inheritance and his own writing income, Esmond Chadleigh had lived there in considerable style until his death in 1967. Esmond Chadleigh was one of those Catholic figures like Chesterton and Belloc, who, in that unrealistic world of England between the wars, had made his mark in almost every department of the world of letters. Adult novelist, children's storyteller, light versifier, essayist, critic, it seemed there was no form of writing to which Esmond Chadleigh could not turn his hand. But when the derisory adjective glib was about to be applied to him, critics were brought up short by a series of deeply felt poems of suffering, published in 1935 under the title Vases of Dead Flowers. Of these, the most famous, a staple of anthologies, school assemblies, memorial services, and Radio 4's With Great Pleasure selections, was the poem Threnody for the Lost. Written, according to Esmond Chadleigh's introduction, nearly 20 years before its first publication, this was a lament for his older brother Graham, who at 18 had set off for the battlefields of Flanders and never returned, even in a coffin. In the room where the trustees were meeting was a glass-topped display case dedicated to the memory of Graham Chadleigh. The space was divided down the middle. On one side there were photographs of Graham as a boy in a house before Brackett's, with his younger brother beside him. Both carried tennis rackets. Then Graham appeared as a member of a cricket team in a gravely posed school photograph dated 1915. Beside this was the faded, tasselled cap of his cricket colours. There was a letter he had written from school to his parents, politely requesting them to send him more tuck. On the other side of the division was the pitifully small collection of memorabilia from Graham Chadleigh's wartime life. There was a letter written to him in the trenches by his father. There were a cap badge and a service revolver. That was all that had been recovered. It was the totality of his absence that could still shock visitors to Brackett's at the beginning of the 21st century. Like many others in the muddy holocaust of Passchendaele, Graham Chadleigh had just vanished off the face of the earth, literally blown to smithereens. That was why his brother's famous poem carried such emotional impact. Threnody for the Lost was a powerful evocation of bereavement, particularly the pain of the mourner left with nothing tangible to mourn. No grave, no lichened tombstone, graven plaque, no yew-treed cross beneath its cloak of moss, no sense but absence, unforgiving dark, the stretching void that is eternal loss. No one of Carole Seddon's generation could have got through school without having learned those lines, and the revival of interest in the Great War towards the end of the 20th century had ensured that the name of Esmond Chadleigh was not forgotten. But, as was being made clear at the Board of Trustees meeting that autumn afternoon, though his name was familiar, It was not familiar enough. The teetering finances of Brackets required the profile of Esmond Chadleigh to be a lot higher than it currently was. Without a substantial injection of cash, closure of the estate as a heritage site was a very real possibility. Gina Locke spelled out the reality in typically uncompromising style. Unless something happens, Brackets might be closing at the end of October for the last time. Gina was mid to late 30s, slight and dark, with undeniable charisma. Carole had met her at a dinner party in the nearby town of Fedborough, and had been immediately taken by the enthusiasm with which she talked about her new job as director of Brackets. It was that enthusiasm which had carried Carole into her current position as a trustee, and which made her feel guilty for her recent thoughts of escaping the role. But then a suspicion that was hardening into a reality made her feel less guilty. She was increasingly certain that she'd been taken on board, and indeed onto the board at Brackets, to provide more support for Gina Locke's personal agenda. If the director thought she was going to get subservience from Carole Seddon, she couldn't have been more wrong. "Aren't you being a little alarmist there?" The languid voice that challenged Gina Locke's pessimism belonged to Graham Chadleigh Bewes, one of the two trustees who were blood relatives of Esmond Chadleigh. He was the great man's grandson. Chubby, in his 50s, with a round body that threatened to spill out of the chair in which it sat, Graham Chadleigh Bewes had one of those faces whose babyishness is only accentuated by the advance of wrinkles and the retreat of hair. His permanent expression was one of mild pique, as though someone else had just appropriated a treat he had been promising himself. Apparently he had had some minor literary career of his own, but most of his energies were now focused on perpetuating the image of his grandfather. The other trustee from the Chadleigh family was Belinda Chadleigh, the younger of Esmond's daughters. Her sister Sonia, Graham's mother, had died of a brain tumour in 1976. Though not yet 70, Belinda behaved as though she were a lot older. She never failed to attend the trustees' meetings, but always failed to make much of an impression once she was there. She was a few lines behind the general discussion, and on the rare occasions she spoke, it was usually to clarify something she had misunderstood. Once she had had the point spelled out to her, the unchanging vagueness in her bleached blue eyes suggested that the explanation had left her none the wiser. "I don't think I'm being alarmist," Gina Locke replied coolly to Graham Chadleigh Bewes's interruption. "I think I'm being realistic." Lord Beniston cleared his throat testily, unwilling to have even that amount of conversation not conducted through the chair. "It would be useful, Gina, if you could give the trustees a quick overview of the current state of Brackets' finances." Exactly what I was about to do. This reply, though not overtly rude, still didn't contain the amount of deference Lord Beniston would have liked. He harumphed again and said, "Well, let's hear the worst, then." "Right." Gina Locke picked up a sheaf of papers in front of her. "You've all been circulated copies of the last 6 months' accounts, which I think are self-explanatory. If there are any details you'd like to pick up on, I'm more than happy to give you fuller information." She allowed a short pause, but no one filled it with any inquiry. "Basically, as you'll see, there is a worrying shortfall between income and expenditure." "Couldn't a lot of that be put down to the foot-and-mouth epidemic, keeping the visitors away?" The new voice was marinated in Cheltenham Ladies' College and money. It belonged to Josie Freeman, whose husband John had started a very successful car parts franchising operation in the late 1980s. His shrewdly calculated marriage had been the first step in a gentrification process that had recently been crowned by an OBE, for services to industry. Josie brought to their partnership the class her husband lacked, and, by way of gratitude, he passed on to her the responsibility of channeling a part of his considerable income into the kind of good causes suitable to the status towards which he aspired. Her acceptance of a trusteeship at Brackets was a part of that process. Josie Freeman had access to a group of equally well-groomed and well-blonded wives of the wealthy, just the kind of essential fundraising contacts that Carole Seddon lacked. Because of her status, Josie was constantly approached by the outstretched